The moment she hummed the forgotten lullaby on the observatory stair, her life was forfeit. She was only Linnea, a cartographer's assistant with ink-stained fingers and a talent for being overlooked, a ghost in the hallowed halls of the Royal Observatory. He was Lord Alaric, the city's dark patron, a man whose age was measured in centuries, not years, and whose heart was rumored to be a shard of ice. He moved through the world of men like a shadow, his wealth and power a velvet glove over an iron fist no one dared to question. But what no one, least of all Linnea, could have known was that the simple tune, a half-remembered melody from her own nursery, was the key to a heart that hadn't beaten in 1,000 years. And for the first time in 300, he felt something other than cold. If you believe a single moment of being truly seen can change a destiny, type witness below and let me tell you what happened next. It started on a night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, scattered like diamond dust on black velvet. Linnea was meant to be invisible. It was a skill she had perfected over years of quiet servitude, first in her father's dusty map shop, and now here, at the prestigious Royal Observatory. She was the assistant to the assistant of the great Mr. Stirling, a man whose ego was as vast and cold as the night sky he claimed to have conquered. Her place was in the margins, cleaning lenses, fetching forgotten books, and, her secret specialty, correcting the minute errors on celestial charts that the more esteemed astronomers were too proud to admit they had made. She had a gift for it, an eye for the subtle warp of a line, the miscalculation of a stellar position that could throw a navigator off by leagues. It was a thankless, silent task. Her corrections would be absorbed into the final work, and Mr. Stirling would take the credit, his name gleaming in gold leaf on the spine of the published atlas. Linnea's name would be nowhere. She would receive her meager wages and the dubious honor of remaining in the orbit of greatness. This particular rejection stung more than most. She had discovered a significant error in the calculations for the new Northern Sky Atlas, a series of charts that were Stirling's magnum opus. She had spent a week drafting a respectful, detailed memorandum, complete with her own revised mathematics. He had not even granted her the courtesy of a private dismissal. In the middle of the grand reading room, in front of colleagues and apprentices, he had held up her pages with 2 fingers, as if they were contaminated. He'd said, his voice dripping with condescension, "Miss Linnett, is it? While I appreciate the diligence of our junior staff, perhaps you should confine your efforts to sharpening pencils. Leave the astronomy to the astronomers." The laughter had been soft, but it had felt like a physical blow. Her name was not Linnett, it was Linnea. But she had not corrected him. She had simply gathered her papers, her face burning, and retreated to the shadows where she belonged. That was 3 days ago. Now a grand gala was underway on the main floor. The observatory's chief patron, the enigmatic and impossibly wealthy Lord Alaric, was in attendance. The air buzzed with the rustle of silk, the clink of crystal, and the murmur of important conversations. Linnea was not part of it. She had been tasked with retrieving a set of lunar charts from the upper observation tower, a spiraling edifice of cold iron and glass that was closed to the party guests. The errand was a punishment, she knew, a way for Stirling to remind her of her place. She didn't mind. The silence of the tower was a balm after the public humiliation. The cold of the iron railing under her hand felt clean, honest. The only sounds were the distant, muffled strains of a string quartet and the whisper of her own soft-soled shoes on the metal steps. The tower smelled of ozone, old brass, and the faint, clean scent of the night air. Up here, alone with the intricate machinery of the great telescope, Linnea felt a sense of peace. The universe was orderly. The stars followed laws. They did not mock you or dismiss you. They simply were. She found the correct drawer in the vast, curved map cabinet and pulled out the rolled charts. As she did, her eyes fell upon the final proofs for Sterling's atlas, left carelessly on a nearby lectern. On impulse, she unrolled one. It was the very chart she had tried to correct, and the error was still there. A glaring mistake in the declination of a key navigational star. A sigh escaped her, a small, sad sound in the cavernous space. It was foolish, but she couldn't leave it. A ship's captain, trusting this chart, could end up wrecked on a rocky shore. She couldn't bear the thought. Setting her lamp down, she pulled a small pot of ink and a fine-tipped pen from the pocket of her apron. It was a habit, carrying the tools of her trade. She unstoppered the ink, knelt on the cold floor, and spread the chart out. And as she worked, her hand moving with practiced, loving precision, she began to hum. It was an unconscious act, a little tune she hummed when she was deeply focused, a melody without words, a simple, looping lullaby her mother used to sing to ward off nightmares. She was so lost in the work, in the delicate dance of ink and parchment, that she did not hear the change in the silence. She did not sense the shift in the air, the way the temperature in the vast dome seemed to drop by 10 degrees. She did not notice the figure that had materialized at the bottom of the spiral staircase, a silhouette of impossible stillness against the distant candlelight. Lord Alaric had grown weary of the party. The fawning politicians, the simpering debutantes, the endless, meaningless chatter. It was all a tedious performance he had perfected over centuries. He endured it because he must. His position as a patron of the sciences gave him a veneer of respectable humanity, a cover for the ancient predator that he was. He had been making his way to a private exit through the tower, a route known only to him and the observatory's director. He moved in utter silence, a wraith in tailored evening clothes, and then he heard it. A sound that pierced the leaden apathy of his soul. A song. A simple, heartbreakingly familiar melody that he had not heard in over 1,000 years. Not since he was a mortal boy, in a land that no longer existed, with a mother whose face was now just a ghost of a memory. He froze, his hand on the cold iron of the railing. The sound was coming from above. It was a woman's voice, a soft, absent-minded hum. It was not a performance. It was something private, something pure. He moved up the stairs, not with his usual inhuman speed, but with a strange, hesitant caution. The shadows in the corners of the tower seemed to deepen and stretch as he ascended, flowing towards him like loyal hounds. The candles in the wall sconces guttered and flickered, their flames bowing in his presence. At the top of the landing, he saw her, a young woman kneeling on the floor. Her back was to him. She was surrounded by starlight from the high, domed windows, her form illuminated by a single, small oil lamp at her side. She was leaning over a massive star chart, a pen in her hand, her head bowed in concentration, and she was humming his mother's lullaby. He watched her for a long, silent moment. He saw the ink stains on her fingers, the frayed hem of her simple gray dress. He saw the intense, focused line of her shoulders, the way she treated the chart, with a reverence he usually only saw from priests before an altar. She was not a guest. She was a worker, anonymous, insignificant to the world. And yet, in that moment, she was the most significant thing in his universe. The humming stopped. She had finished her correction. She blotted the ink carefully, her breath held. Then, with a small sigh of satisfaction, she began to roll the chart back up. It was only then that she must have felt his presence. The unnatural cold, the weight of his stare. She went utterly still. The chart slipped from her fingers and unfurled with a soft rustle of parchment. Slowly, she turned. Her eyes were wide in the lamplight, a warm, clear brown. They were not filled with the avarice or ambition he usually saw. They were filled with surprise and a flicker of fear, but mostly curiosity. She looked at him not as a title or a vault of gold, but as a man who had appeared unexpectedly in a silent room. His voice, when it came, was rust on an old hinge. He had not used it for a genuine question in a very long time. "The song," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. "Where did you learn that song?" Linnea's heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. It was Lord Alaric. There was no mistaking him. He was taller than she'd imagined, and the ambient chill that always seemed to surround him was not a poetic exaggeration. It was a real, physical cold that leached the warmth from the air. His eyes in the dim light seemed to hold no reflection, just a depth of darkness that was utterly absorbing. She saw a flicker of crimson at the edges of his irises and dismissed it as a trick of the lamplight. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She should be curtsying. She should be apologizing for her presence, for the ink, for daring to exist in his line of sight. But his question was so strange, so direct. It short-circuited all her ingrained deference. She found her own voice, small but steady. "It's just a tune, my lord. My mother used to sing it." "Your mother," he repeated. The words were flat, devoid of inflection, yet they held the weight of centuries. He took a step closer. The shadows clinging to his coat seemed to wriggle and recoil, as if reluctant to enter the small pool of her lamplight. He gestured with a long-fingered hand towards the chart on the floor. "You were correcting the work of Mr. Stirling." It was not a question. Panic flared in her chest. She was caught. This was it. She would be dismissed, thrown out into the street for her audacity. I apologize, my lord. It was an impulse. The error was significant. I did not want it to be published." He knelt, a surprisingly fluid motion for a man of his stature, and brought his face closer to the chart. His proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of cold night air, old leather, and something else, something like dry earth and frost. The candle flame beside her flickered violently, as if in a sudden gale, though the air was perfectly still. His finger, clad in a black leather glove, traced the line she had just inked. It hovered over her correction, not quite touching the parchment. "You are certain of this?" "Yes, my lord," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. This was her territory. The original calculation failed to account for the precession of the equinoxes over a 50-year span. It's a common oversight, but it would render the chart useless for long-range navigation within a decade. He looked up from the chart, his gaze locking with hers. The intensity in his eyes was a physical force. It felt as if he were looking not just at her, but through her, reading the years of quiet study, the lonely nights, the sting of Stirling's dismissal. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was low, a velvet rumble that vibrated in the air between them. "Linnea, my lord." "Linnea," he repeated, tasting the word. It sounded different in his mouth. Not the name of an overlooked assistant, but something precious. You have a cartographer's hand, but an astronomer's mind, Linnea. He rose to his full height, casting her once more in his long shadow. He looked down at her, and for a moment, the icy mask of the aristocrat seemed to crack. She saw a flicker of something ancient and deeply lonely in his eyes. "Go home," he said, his tone once again remote, commanding. "Your work here is finished for the night." And then he was gone. He did not walk down the stairs. He simply turned, and the shadows seemed to swallow him whole. One moment he was there, a towering, cold presence. The next, there was only the lingering chill in the air and the frantic, echoing beat of her own heart. The next day, a carriage arrived for her. Not a common cab, but a lacquered black coach with no crest, pulled by two perfectly matched black horses that seemed to absorb the morning light. The footman, a man with a face like carved stone, delivered a single, heavy vellum envelope sealed with black wax. It was a summons, not to the observatory for her dismissal, as she had feared all night, but to Blackwood Manor, the residence of Lord Alaric. Mr. Sterling intercepted her as she was leaving her small boarding room, her hands trembling as she clutched the summons. He must have been waiting for her. "Miss Linnea," he said, his voice a mockery of politeness. He used her correct name now. That, more than anything, set her on edge. "I hear you've been summoned to the master's house. One can only imagine what sort of impression you made on Lord Alaric last night." His insinuation was ugly, and it hung in the air of the drab hallway. He thought she had caught the Lord's eye in some sordid way. He could not conceive of any other reason for the patron to notice a lowly assistant. For the first time in her life, Linnea did not shrink. She met his gaze directly. "I believe," she said, her voice clear and cold, "he was impressed with the quality of my work." She brushed past him, leaving him standing there, his mouth slightly agape. The small victory did little to calm the storm in her stomach. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a geological feature, a fortress of gray stone and black slate that seemed to grow out of the very rock of the hillside overlooking the city. It brooded under the gray sky, windows like vacant eyes. No smoke rose from its many chimneys. No birds sang in the ancient twisted oaks that surrounded it. She was led through a hall of chilling grandeur. The air was still and cold, preserved like a specimen in a jar. The floors were polished black marble that reflected the vaulted ceilings like a dark, still lake. There were no paintings of smiling ancestors, only vast, somber tapestries depicting nocturnal landscapes and celestial events. Everything was silent. The footfalls of her guide, the same stony-faced man from the carriage, made no sound. He led her not to a drawing room or a parlor, but to the library. And it was a library that stole her breath away. It was a cathedral dedicated to the written word. 2 stories high, with soaring arches and a gallery that ran along the upper level. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with thousands upon thousands of volumes. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. In the center of the room, on a massive oak table, lay the reason for her summons. Lord Alaric stood beside it, dressed not in evening wear, but in a simple dark tunic and trousers that seemed more fitting to his ageless quality. He did not turn as she entered. "Come closer, Linnea," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. She approached the table. Spread across its surface were not printed books, but ancient hand-painted scrolls and folios bound in cracked leather. The parchment was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, in some places flaking away entirely. They were star charts, but like none she had ever seen. The constellations were subtly different, the celestial bodies arranged in patterns that were thousands of years out of date. Some depicted stars she had never heard of, stars that no longer shone in their sky. My family has a long and complicated history with the stars, Lord Alaric said, his gloved hand hovering over a magnificent, crumbling map of the heavens. These charts are the oldest part of my inheritance. They are also the most fragile. He finally turned to look at her. The morning light from the tall, arched windows did not seem to touch him. It bent around him, leaving him in a perpetual state of twilight. His eyes held that same unnerving intensity. They are decaying, he said simply. The knowledge they contain is fading from the world. I have had scholars attempt to preserve them. They have all failed. Their methods were too clumsy. Their hands lacked the necessary reverence. He paused, his gaze unwavering. You, however, I watched you last night. You do not merely copy, you understand. You heal the page. This was the revelation. This was his motive. It was not her humming, not some sentimental whim. It was her skill. He had seen her, truly seen her work, and recognized its worth. These are more than just maps of the sky, aren't they? She asked, her voice a whisper. She could feel it. There was a faint, thrumming energy coming from the parchments, a resonance that vibrated in her teeth. A slow, cold smile touched his lips. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator confirming a successful hunt. You are perceptive. No, they are not just maps. They are instruments. They chart the flow of energies you cannot see, the celestial tides that govern certain natures. He was giving her a choice, she realized. An exit. He had laid the truth bare, shrouded in metaphor, but clear enough for anyone with an ounce of sense. He was not human. These charts were connected to his power, to his very existence. There is a celestial alignment approaching, he continued, his voice dropping lower. One that has not occurred in 900 years. It is a time of great vulnerability for me. Before that day, these charts must be restored. The pathways of power must be made clear again. He was asking her to help him, to restore the arcane knowledge that sustained his unnatural life. The sensible part of her, the part that had survived by being small and quiet, screamed at her to run, to make her excuses and flee this cold, silent house and the ancient, dangerous being who inhabited it. But another part of her, the part that had knelt on the cold observatory floor and poured her heart into a single, perfect line of ink, was captivated. Here was a challenge worthy of her gifts. Here was a puzzle centuries in the making. And more than that, when he spoke of vulnerability, she had seen that flicker again in his eyes. Not of a predator, but of something infinitely old and weary, chained to a cycle he could not escape. For the briefest moment, she felt a pang of profound compassion for this creature of eternal night. He was offering her the one thing she had always been denied, the chance for her work to matter, to be essential. She looked from his cold, waiting face to the beautiful, dying maps on the table. She thought of Mr. Sterling's sneer. She thought of a lifetime of being invisible. I will need my own tools, she said, her voice steady, and a constant supply of Northern Source iron gall ink. The acidity needs to be precisely balanced. The smile on Lord Alaric's face softened, losing some of its predatory edge. A genuine, almost imperceptible warmth touched his eyes. They will be provided. You will work here. You will want for nothing. He had chosen her, and she, in turn, had chosen him. She had agreed to become the keeper of a monster's stars. Would you have agreed to help a monster restore his power, knowing that power could one day be used against you? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Linnea was given a suite of rooms in a wing of the manor that, while still grand and somber, felt less haunted. A fire was always lit in the hearth. Fresh flowers appeared on the mantelpiece, though she never saw who brought them. Her world shrank to the vast, silent library. Every morning, she would enter to find a tray with a light breakfast and a pot of steaming tea waiting for her on a small side table. Lord Alaric was never there in the daylight hours. The house was hers, a silent, echoing kingdom of books. She worked with a feverish, joyful intensity she had never known. The ancient charts were a revelation. They were part astronomical, part alchemical, part something else entirely. They mapped not just stars, but the invisible ley lines of the earth, the way they shifted and pulsed in response to cosmic events. They were a form of magic so intertwined with science that they were indistinguishable, and they were dying. The parchment was so brittle in places that it threatened to turn to dust at a touch. She learned to humidify the room with pans of water, to handle the scrolls with the lightest possible touch. She mixed her own inks, grinding pigments and carefully balancing the pH to match the original composition, ensuring her additions would not eat through the delicate fibers over time. It was painstaking, soul-consuming work, and she had never been happier. The nights belonged to him. As dusk bled across the sky, he would appear. He never made an entrance. He would simply be there, standing in the shadows by the fireplace or seated in a tall-backed chair in a far corner of the room, watching her. At first, the silence between them was heavy, fraught with the unspoken chasm of what he was. But Linnea was a creature of silence herself. She did not try to fill it with chatter. She simply worked, aware of his gaze as a constant, cool pressure on her skin. Then, he began to speak. He would ask her questions about her work, his voice a low counterpoint to the scratching of her pen. "Why that pigment?" he asked one evening, as she was mixing a small pot of lapis lazuli. "The original artist used it for this particular star cluster," she explained without looking up. "It has a unique crystalline structure that refracts light differently. They believed it captured the star's true essence, not just its image." "They were correct," he murmured, and the conversation would end, leaving her with the unsettling feeling that he had known the artist personally. Slowly, she began to ask her own questions, testing the boundaries. "This constellation," she said one night, pointing with the wooden end of her brush to a cluster of stars she didn't recognize. "I can find no record of it. It's not on any modern charts." He moved from the shadows to stand behind her, leaning over her shoulder to look. She could feel the cold radiating from him, a stark contrast to the warmth of her lamp. She forced herself not to flinch. "It is called the Serpent's Crown," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Its light faded from your sky 1,200 years ago. Its last rays were beautiful." He spoke of the past as if it were the next room. He talked about seeing comets that were now just footnotes in astronomical texts. He described the color of the sky over ancient Babylon, the scent of the library at Alexandria before it burned. He never said, "I was there." He did not need to. Through these conversations, a new image of him began to form in her mind. He was not just a predator. He was a witness, an eternal, lonely observer, carrying the weight of ages in his silent heart. The first vampire king she had ever imagined, and he was nothing like the crude monsters of legend. He was a being of profound melancholy, trapped in an endless, unchanging present. One evening, she worked late, struggling with a particularly damaged section of a chart depicting a solar eclipse from an impossibly distant past. Frustration mounted, and her hand slipped, the sharp point of her compass pricking the fleshy part of her thumb. A single perfect drop of red welled up. "Ah!" she hissed, pulling her hand back, instinctively putting the thumb to her mouth. Across the room, there was a sound like a chair scraping violently on stone. She looked up, startled. Lord Alaric was on his feet. He had been seated in the shadows, and now he stood halfway in the light, frozen in a posture of terrifying tension. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. His face was a mask of brutal conflict, and his eyes, they were no longer the dark, absorbing voids she was used to. They were blazing, a solid, horrifying crimson. The hunger in them was not an abstract concept. It was a raw, physical force that hit her like a wave, stealing the breath from her lungs. The shadows in the room writhed and coiled around him, a storm of darkness responding to its master's agitation. This was the monster, not the lonely scholar, not the weary immortal. This was the predator she had chosen to ignore. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. She could feel it, a hot, living pulse in the tiny wound on her thumb. She did not scream. She did not run. She met his burning gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she did something she could not explain, even to herself. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hand from her mouth and wrapped her thumb in a clean corner of her apron, hiding the drop of blood from his sight. It was a gesture of trust, a quiet statement that she would not treat him like a beast, that she saw the man warring with the monster inside. The effect was instantaneous. He flinched as if she had struck him. A shudder ran through his powerful frame. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the terrible crimson light was gone, banked like embers, leaving only the familiar, fathomless darkness. The shadows in the room settled back into their corners. He said nothing. He simply turned and swept from the room, leaving her alone with the echoing silence and the faint, coppery scent of her own blood in the air. He did not return for 2 nights. Linnea worked on, her focus shattered, her hands trembling. She had seen the truth of him, and it terrified her. But stranger still is the fact that her terror was eclipsed by a different emotion, a deep, aching pity. She had seen the agony of his control, the constant 1,000-year war he fought with himself. When he finally reappeared on the 3rd night, the atmosphere between them was different. The formal distance was gone, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. He found her asleep at her desk in the hour just before dawn, her head pillowed on her arms, a fine-nibbed pen still clutched in her hand. The lamp had burned low, casting a soft, golden light on her sleeping face. He stood over her for a long time, his expression unreadable. He looked at her exhausted face, the smudge of ink on her cheek, the fierce dedication that had driven her to collapse. No one had ever worked for him like this. Not for fear, not for gold, but for the work itself. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air for a moment, before gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was impossibly cold, like marble, yet it did not wake her. He then removed the heavy velvet cloak from his own shoulders, a garment woven with shadows and the cold of the grave, and draped it carefully over her. The cloak settled around her like a pool of night, instantly shielding her from the chill of the library. His hand lingered on the velvet over her shoulder for a heartbeat longer than necessary. In that moment, a strange, protective feeling stirred in the frozen depths of his chest. It was a feeling so ancient, he no longer had a name for it. He had brought her here for her skill. He had kept her here for the echo of a song. But now he wanted to keep her here for reasons that had nothing to do with charts or stars or the ghosts of his past. He wanted to keep her safe in the small, warm circle of her own lamplight. And that was a danger greater than any celestial alignment. Meanwhile, in the world of gaslight and ambition that Linnea had left behind, jealousy was curdling into obsession. Mr. Sterling could not let it go. The elevation of his insignificant assistant was a personal affront. He had been publicly lauded for the corrections to the Northern Sky Atlas, corrections he now knew were not his, and the praise had turned to ash in his mouth. Lord Alaric, the ultimate prize, the patron whose favor could guarantee a man a place in history, had looked right past him and chosen an ink-stained little nobody. He began to dig. He was a scholar, after all. Research was his weapon. He spent his days in dusty archives, not looking at stars, but at property deeds, society columns, and shipping manifests from decades, then centuries past. He found things, oddities, a signature on a document from 100 years ago, written in a familiar, elegant hand, a mention in a diary from the Regency era of a reclusive, wealthy lord who never seemed to age, rumors and whispers dismissed as folklore of a noble family with a cold affliction. The pieces began to fit together into a monstrous mosaic. Lord Alaric was not just reclusive, he was impossible. Sterling's academic curiosity quickly soured into righteous terror. He was not just a cuckolded academic. He was a sentinel who had discovered a monster hiding in their midst. And Linnea, she was not a rival. She was a collaborator, a witch who had sold her soul for preferment. He found others who shared his fears, a fanatical, secret society of self-proclaimed purifiers who dedicated their lives to hunting what they called the unnatural. They were zealots, dismissed by most as cranks, but they had their own network, their own dark knowledge. When Sterling brought them his research on Lord Alaric, they listened with rapt attention. They knew the name. They had legends of a powerful, ancient creature, a vampire king who ruled from the shadows. They had simply never been able to locate him. Sterling had given them their target, and he had given them the key to his destruction. "There is a celestial alignment soon," Sterling explained to their grim-faced leader in a clandestine meeting in a church crypt. "My research indicates these creatures are weakened by such events. And I know his weakness. A girl. He is protecting her. He keeps her at his estate." A plan was formed. A cruel, simple plan. They would wait for the night of the alignment. They would break into Blackwood Manor when its master was at his most vulnerable. And they would use the girl, Linnea, to draw him out. They would cleanse the city of its oldest shadow. Sterling felt a thrill of righteous power. He would not just be vindicated. He would be a hero. He would save the world from a monster, and in doing so erase the memory of the girl who had dared to be better than him. Back at Blackwood Manor, the work was nearly complete. The final, most complex chart lay on the table. It depicted the coming alignment, a rare conjunction of planets that, according to the arcane symbols, would disrupt the flow of the Earth's energies, creating a kind of static that interfered with Alaric's connection to the power that sustained him. Linnea felt the tension in the house. It was in the way the shadows seemed deeper, more restless. It was in the way Alaric himself had grown more withdrawn, his silences longer, the lines of strain visible around his eyes. One night, as the alignment was only 2 days away, he stood before the great unlit fireplace, staring into its black depths. "You should leave, Linnea," he said, his voice quiet, rough-edged. "Your work is done. You are not safe here now." She looked up from the chart, her pen stilled. "Safe from what? From you?" He turned to her, and the weariness in his face was profound. "From the world. From those who will not understand. They will see you as my creature. They will hunt you too." She rose from her chair and walked towards him, stopping a few feet away. "You brought me here to fix your maps. But it was more than that, wasn't it? You've been alone for a very long time, Lord Alaric." The use of his title felt formal, strange, after the intimacy of their shared nights. "Loneliness is the price of survival," he said, his voice hard. "Is it?" she challenged softly. "Or is it just a habit? You saw my skill. You saw my mind. But Mr. Sterling and all the others, they only ever saw a servant girl. You are the first person who has ever truly seen me. I will not abandon you to face this alone." She would not be a pawn. She would not be a damsel to be protected and set aside. She had chosen this path, and she would see it to its end. She was standing beside him, not behind him. A flicker of disbelief, then a wave of some fierce, unfamiliar emotion crossed his face. Before he could speak, a sound shattered the ancient silence of the house. The crash of breaking glass from the lower floors. The night of the alignment had arrived, and the hunters were at the door. Instinct took over. Alaric moved, not with his usual fluid grace, but with a stiff, labored effort. The alignment was already affecting him, draining his strength. "Get behind me," he commanded, his voice a low growl. The shadows in the library surged towards him, coalescing around his form like living armor. But Linnea did not move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was surprisingly clear. "No," she said. "They're using me as bait. They expect you to protect me. They expect me to hide." Shouts echoed from the main hall, the heavy thud of a battering ram against the ancient oak doors. "We can't fight them in the open," she said, her mind racing, connecting points on a map that only she could see. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantelpiece. "The charts, the house. I know the way. Not just the hallways, the old ways, the ones that aren't on any builder's plans." He stared at her, his dark eyes wide with a new kind of surprise. He was the master of this house, but she was the one who had learned its secrets. "The crypts," she said, her voice urgent. The charts showed a passage from the wine cellar that connects to the ancestral crypts beneath the hill. "They're a maze, a trap." He saw her plan in an instant. Not to run, not to hide, to hunt. A grim, terrible smile touched his lips. Even weakened, he was still the lord of this domain. "Lead the way, my cartographer," he rasped. She led him through a series of dark, winding service corridors, their path lit only by the single candle she carried. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, then faded as they descended deeper into the foundations of the manor. Alaric followed, his movements becoming more certain, more powerful as they moved away from the open sky and into the deep earth, his native element. They reached the wine cellar, a vast, cavernous space smelling of damp earth and aging wine. Linnea went to a far wall, her hands tracing the cold stone until she found it, a seam that was not on any mortal blueprint. She pushed, and a section of the wall ground open, revealing a narrow, dark passage. They plunged into the darkness of the crypts. Up above, Sterling and the purifiers had breached the main doors. They found the library empty, the charts laid out on the table like an invitation. "He's run!" one of the men shouted. "He's weak," Sterling spat, his eyes wild with fanaticism. "He's taken the girl. Find them. He cannot have gone far." They spread through the house, their lanterns casting frantic, dancing shadows. It was Sterling who found the trail, the faint scuff marks leading to the service corridors. He led the charge downwards, his heart pounding with the thrill of the chase. He was the first to enter the crypt. The air was frigid, thick with the silence of ages. The narrow passage opened into a vast chamber, a labyrinth of stone sarcophagi and crumbling archways. "He's in here," Sterling whispered, his voice echoing. "Spread out. Find the girl." It was a fatal mistake. The moment his men separated, the darkness itself came alive. It was not a mere absence of light. It was a presence. A thick, cold, sentient blackness that poured from the corners and from the empty eye sockets of stone effigies. Alaric's shadows, his oldest companions, come to play. One by one, the purifiers screamed as the darkness enveloped them. There was no sound of struggle, just a choked-off cry, and then silence. Their lanterns clattered to the stone floor, their flames instantly extinguished by the suffocating cold. Soon, only Sterling was left, standing in the center of the chamber, his lantern held aloft, its light a pathetic, trembling circle in the overwhelming dark. "Show yourself, demon!" he shrieked, his courage dissolving into terror. From the shadows behind a towering sarcophagus, Linnea stepped into the light. She was alone. "She's here!" Sterling cried, a triumphant, desperate sound. He lunged towards her. "The monster's whore!" He never reached her. A hand shot out from the darkness beside her, grabbing him by the throat. It was Alaric. He was no longer weakened. Here, in the heart of his domain, surrounded by the bones of his ancestors and the cold earth, he was whole. His eyes were blazing crimson, but it was not the fire of hunger. It was the cold, white-hot fire of wrath. He lifted Sterling off the ground with one hand, the man's legs kicking uselessly in the air. "You wished to see a monster." Alaric's voice was a graveyard rumble. "Look upon me and despair." He did not kill him. It was something far crueler. He forced Sterling to look into his eyes, and he let him see. He showed him not fangs or claws, but time. The endless, crushing weight of centuries. The loneliness. The burden. He poured the undiluted horror of his own existence into Sterling's petty, ambitious mind. Sterling screamed, a raw, ragged sound that went on and on until it broke. When Alaric finally dropped him, he was a husk. He lay whimpering on the cold stone, his eyes vacant, his hair seemingly turned white at the temples. The fanatical zeal was gone, replaced by a profound, mind-shattering terror. The other purifiers, who the shadows had merely disarmed and terrified, stumbled out of the darkness to see their leader broken. They looked from the gibbering Sterling to the towering, wrathful figure of Alaric, and then to the small, calm woman standing beside him, and they understood. They had been fools. They had been led by a man's petty jealousy into a war they could never win. They fled, leaving Sterling to his madness. The aftermath was silent. Alaric turned to Linnea. The crimson in his eyes faded, leaving them dark and weary. "He will trouble you no more," he said. Linnea looked at the broken man on the floor, then back at Alaric. She felt no triumph, only a deep, sad weariness. She reached out and for the first time touched him willingly. She laid her hand on his arm. His sleeve was cold as ice, but beneath it she felt a tremor, the echo of the power he had just unleashed. "Let's go back to the light," she said softly. 6 months later, the Royal Society held its annual gala. The great hall was filled with the most brilliant minds of the age, and at the center of it all stood Mr. Stirling. He was a changed man. His hair was still shot through with premature gray. His eyes were perpetually haunted, and he shied away from sudden movements and dark corners. His career was over, his spirit broken. He was a ghost at the feast. The great announcement of the evening was made by the Society's president. A new, magnificent wing was to be added to the Royal Observatory, complete with the most advanced telescopic instruments in the world. The benefactor, of course, was the reclusive Lord Alaric. He stood on the dais, a figure of dark elegance, but he was not alone. "This project," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the hushed hall, "is not merely my own. It is the vision of its future director, a mind whose talent for celestial mechanics and historical cartography is unparalleled." He turned and extended a hand. "May I present the director of the Alaric Wing for Celestial Studies, Miss Linnea." A collective gasp went through the room. Linnea, who had been standing quietly at the side of the stage, stepped forward. She was not in her servant's gray, but in a simple, elegant gown the color of a midnight sky. Her hair was up, her gaze was steady. She was no longer invisible. She walked to the center of the stage and took Alaric's hand. He raised her hand to his lips, a gesture of profound public respect. Every eye in the room was on her. The men who had dismissed her, the women who had ignored her, and Mr. Stirling, who was forced to witness the triumph of the woman he had tried to destroy. He saw her not as a collaborator or a victim, but as a queen standing beside her king. The world that had rejected her was now laid at her feet. Her old wounds were not just healed, they were transformed into a crown. Later that night, long after the gala had ended, Linnea and Alaric stood in the highest dome of the old observatory, the place where they had first met. The city lights twinkled below them, a pale imitation of the brilliant stars above. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the slow, majestic turning of the heavens. A year passed. The Alaric Wing was built, a marvel of brass and glass and stone. Under Linnea's direction, it became a center of discovery, pushing the boundaries of known science. She was no longer an assistant. She was a leader, respected, admired, and a little feared. She and Alaric were a constant, quiet presence in each other's lives. He was the silent patron, the shadow behind the throne. She was the brilliant mind, the public face of their shared passion for the cosmos. Their love story was not one of grand pronouncements, but of shared work, quiet companionship, and the deep, unspoken understanding of two souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. One night, as they stood together in the new observatory, looking through the magnificent new telescope, he finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "The stars you see are fleeting, Linnea," he said, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. "Your life, to me, is the flicker of a candle flame, bright, beautiful, and tragically brief." He turned from the eyepiece to look at her. His face was serious, the ancient loneliness back in his eyes. "There is a way," he said softly, "a way for you to see all of this. to see the stars die and be reborn, to stand with me and watch the turning of the ages. It is a choice I would never force upon you, but it is a choice you have." He was offering her eternity, not as his creature, but as his companion. He was offering her the one thing he possessed: time. Linnea looked away from the telescope, her eyes leaving the distant, cold stars to focus on his face. She saw the centuries of solitude etched there. She saw the monster, the scholar, the king, and the lonely man. She saw the one who had seen her when no one else had. She reached up and touched his face, her warm hand a stark contrast to his cool skin. "I have seen how you live with forever," she said, her voice full of a compassion that still humbled him. "And I do not fear it," she smiled, a small, certain smile. "I have spent my whole life charting the heavens, Alaric. Show me what they look like from the other side of time. I choose you. I choose forever." He searched her eyes for any hint of doubt, any flicker of fear, and found only a calm, steady love that mirrored his own. He leaned down and for the first time he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger, but of solemn promise. A joining of two souls, one mortal, one eternal under the silent, watching eyes of the stars they both loved. Her choice was made. Their story was just beginning. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where overlooked brilliance becomes a guiding star, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.